just in terms of the people, I think the number of people here tonight is a pretty good indication of the interest and the topical nature of pumped hydro. And if you're anything like me, it's probably an indication of your uncertainty about what pumped hydro really is. Why do we need it? What is it? Why do we need it? Where does it fit into a variable energy generation portfolio? And what are the barriers? I mean, it's something like 96% of the world's energy is stored in pumped hydro, but very little in Australia. So are there barriers here, or is it something that we just have to catch up to the rest of the world? And it's also pretty topical. I mean, you can't pick up a newspaper these days without seeing something about energy, renewables, and the need for storage for those renewables. And also, it's also in the political arena. You can't, Prime Minister Turnbull's making a lot of mileage out of Snowy Hydro 2.0. So it's a topical topic, and I think it's a topic that there's a little bit of uncertainty. As I said, it's also in the paper. I picked up the Herald this morning, and there's a couple of articles in the Herald. One, I'll read one extract, which I think just sets the scene for pumped hydro. This comes from Anne Pearson, who is the Chief Executive of Australian Energy Market Commission, and she said that and I'm not sure whether this is true, but she said we have enough power for the here and now, but the way we manage the power system needs to change. She then goes on to say that it has to be managed differently in response to this change in generation mix, which is replacing thermal generation with equivalent renewable, but more intermittent energy. And the network must plan to keep energy stable with demand when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. I think that's the key to it. It's about, as the renewables grow, the need for storage of the energy is increasingly important. As I said, I think we're privileged to have a couple of speakers here tonight who are involved in the seminar just running at the Grace Hotel. Both very knowledgeable in different aspects of pumped hydro and how it fits into the energy system and what the barriers may be. Before I actually introduce the speakers, just the format, I think they'll speak for about 20 minutes, half an hour each. And rather than have questions after each speaker, because we might cover off those answers by the other speakers, I'll wait till both speakers are finished, and I'll get them both back up where they are now, and we'll have a Q&A. Hopefully finish around 7:30, 7:45. If the speakers go over half an hour, we'll stop them, and if we go over beyond 7:45, I will stop the seminar, but I'm not expecting to go much beyond 7:30. The first speaker tonight is Professor Andrew Blakers. He's a Professor of Engineering at the Australian National University. He's a research interest in the areas of solar, photovoltaic energy and sustainable energy policy. His extensive experience with basic and applied research has led the team that developed the PERC solar cell technology, which currently has approximately 1/4 of the world's solar market. He's currently engaged in detailed analysis of energy systems with high penetration of wind and photovoltaics with support from pumped hydro energy storage. So I'd just like to welcome Andrew to the lecture.
Okay, is that showing properly?
Yep.
Okay, good. So my name is Andrew Blakers. I'm going to talk about pumped hydro, not in of itself, but more in context of the ever-growing PV and wind market. And the next speaker will fill in a lot more details about the actual mechanics of pumped hydro. So the main focus is 100% renewable electricity followed by 100% renewable energy. And the short message is it's not all that hard. So what you see there is a graph of Australia where the numbers are the noon equivalent sunshine hours per day. Port Hedland up in the northwest is one of the best places in the world. Tasmania, southwest Tasmania, it rains a lot, and that's better solar there than all of northern Europe, where it also rains a lot and has lots of gloomy sky. And we also have fabulous wind. So Australia is really an energy superpower in renewables. And the large green circle there is the area of land required to supply all of the world's energy services, not electricity. And the red dot is ditto for Australia. So Australia has heaps of room to supply the entire world's energy requirements in 2050. And of course it wouldn't be all in one country, it would be spread all over the whole world. So wind and solar PV have won the race. It's all over Red Rover. Wind PV is the #1 net new generation capacity installed worldwide each year. Wind is #2. Coal has been pushed into #3 spot, and this trend is only going to get more and more extreme. And the other renewables are either intolerably constrained by lack of resources, such as conventional hydro or bio or geothermal, or are just too far behind the game, like concentrating solar power, to ever catch up, barring some energy miracle. So PV has been growing and growing continuously for 50 years, typically at 10 to 50% growth rates per year. Over the last 5 years, it's been averaging 28% a year, which is typical. And PV and wind together are now 7% of worldwide electricity production, so they're now visible. And when you have that exponential growth, with a doubling every 3 years, then the time scale between becoming visible and becoming completely dominant is very short, as you'll see in a moment. So there's going to be about 500 gigawatts of PV in the world by the end of this year. Wind is a bit ahead at about 600 gigawatts. Together they completely dominate energy systems. So in 2016, PV and wind together, in terms of net new generation capacity, was the same as everything else put together. That's fossil, nuclear and all the other renewables. In 2018, PV and wind together will do about 200 gigawatts. Everything else together will do 130, 150 gigawatts. And in 2020, PV and wind will be 70%, and then a few years later it'll be 80%, 90%. So fairly soon, no one will be building anything other than PV and wind, simply because they're cheaper than everything else. And that arises from ever improving technology and ever increasing mass production with all the economies of scale that produces. Looking at Australia, in 2016, PV and wind were effectively 100% of new generation capacity. In fact, fossil fuels, of course, went backwards, and they will go backwards every year. And we're doing about 4 gigawatts in Australia this year of PV and wind. And the reason for the closure of coal power stations is that they're very old. And this is simply a graph of the retirement schedule assuming a 50-year lifetime. And I'm fairly sure that the retirement schedule will be a lot faster than that, because PV and wind will undercut not only new generation coal, but also the marginal cost of operating an old, inefficient, clunky, breaking down coal power station. State-based targets, in the absence of federal government guidance, are quite significant. Tasmania, of course, is already 100% hydro and wind. The ACT has contracted enough PV wind farms to get to 100% in 2020. South Australia, despite the change of government, will be 75% nominally by 2025, but much more likely by 2021. Victoria is contracting 40% by 2025. It'd be very surprising if they didn't pass that. Queensland 50% by 2030, same comment. And Northern Territory 50% by 2030. And West Australia, New South Wales and the federal government need to get back together to have some formal targets. So just looking ahead in Australia, demand has been more or less constant. That's the red line on the top since 2008, and there's no reason to think that demand's actually going to change much into the future, with a proviso that as we electrify transport and heat, demand will tick up. But just leaving that aside, if we just assume going forward from 2016 through to 2030, the demand stays more or less constant, then if we just assume that the current build this year of 4.5 gigawatts of PV and wind continues, no growth, then we end up at 70% PV and wind in 2030. Sorry, 70% renewables in 2030 and 100% by 2033 or 2034. And I think this is actually quite likely to happen faster than that, because PV and wind are now just so cheap compared with even the marginal cost of running a sunk cost power station. So the take-home message is change is happening fast, and it always happens twice as fast or 4 times as fast as the federal government would have you believe. They're just so far behind the game. And every year it's the same message, that the International Energy Agency, the Australian government, all these other major national and international institutions are just so far behind what's actually happening on the ground. So how do you deal with getting to 100% variable wind and PV? Well, the first is you have both. The sun never shines at night, but the wind often blows at night. That's really helpful. And so you disperse the wind and PV collectors over very large areas. And that means that adverse weather in one place is smoothed out by good weather in some other place. So if there's a cold, wet, windless week in winter in Victoria, that doesn't mean that there's no sunshine and wind in New South Wales and Tasmania and Townsville, for example. The third is obviously demand management. You try and trim the peaks in particular, because meeting that last peak adds a very large amount of money to the overall cost of running the system, while adding on a very small utility of air conditioning on a hot summer afternoon. And finally, you do need storage, and really there's only 2 shows in town, and that's pumped hydro, which is about 97% of all storage, and batteries, which are rising in importance. So how do you move power from one place to another? High voltage AC people would be familiar with. As you drive around the countryside, you'll see these towers with 2 or 3 lines on the top of them, conducting at hundreds of kilovolts over long distances. But you can't really transmit large amounts of power over more than about 1,000 kilometres using AC. You need to switch to DC, running at anything up to 1.1 megavolts. And there, the state of the art is really quite remarkable. You can talk about 12 gigawatts transmitted over 3,000 kilometres with a loss of 10%. So you can take wind and solar and hydropower from the west of China and transmit it to where people live in the east. You can take power from Perth and put it into the eastern state system, or power from Townsville and put it into Victoria. And the loss is about 10%, and the price is amazingly acceptable. And this is really important because it means you can spread the PV and wind out over millions of square kilometres, which means that you're very unlikely to get adverse weather everywhere. So you can talk about big grids that access attractive places where there's lots of wind and PV. Importantly, where the weather is different from the little corner in the southeast where most of the population lives. And you can transmit it at a very acceptable price. So at my university, we've undertaken a GIS automated pumped hydro site search to look at what the potential is for pumped hydro in Australia. And there are 3 extant pumped hydros in Australia at the moment: Waimaho near Brisbane, Shoalhaven system in just south of Sydney, and the Tumut 3 power station in the Snowy Mountain scheme. And there's a couple of gigawatts of pumping capacity there, but we need more like 20 gigawatts of pumping capacity to support a 100% renewable electricity system. So we need a lot more. So we set a minimum head, that's the height difference between the upper and lower reservoirs of a pumped hydro system, of 300 metres. That means we build a little reservoir down the bottom, another one at the top, and water circulates in a closed loop between them. When there's excess PV and wind, the water goes uphill. When you need that energy back again, it comes back down through the turbine. And the turbine is normally a pump turbine, it just runs in reverse to pump. And the area of land, the area of these reservoirs is really quite small. It's a few hundred hectares each is sufficient to support a gigawatt rated power system. So we don't look inside national parks, and we found, in fact, a very large number of opportunities, 22,000 of them actually, which is about 1,000 times more than we actually need to support a 100% renewable electricity system. So in other words, we can be extremely choosy about which hydro sites that we develop and only pick the very best. If there's a problem, you just walk away, go over, there will be another one, then another one, then another one. So each of those red dots represents a group of reservoirs, and there's 22,000 altogether there. And if you go to our website, which I'll have at the end of the presentation, you can download an Excel spreadsheet with all the details of these sites, and also a KMZ file which you can run in Google Earth and effectively fly around synthetic images of these sites. So they're spread, not surprisingly, up and down the Great Dividing Range. Very importantly, there's a good bunch near Alice Springs, which has very good wind and PV as well, and is a very attractive place which you could connect into the national electricity market to get diversity of location, diversity of weather. So just an example, looking in the southeast of New South Wales, lots of them in the Snowy Mountains outside the national park, and lots of them up and down the coast ranges outside the national park there. And if you go to our website, as I mentioned, you'll see you can download a KMZ file which lets you see images like this on Google Earth, and then you can rotate it, fly around as if you're in a drone, and have a look at the reservoirs. You can click on a reservoir and get information about the volume and the altitude and the latitude, longitude. You can click on one of those synthetic dam walls and get information about how much rock there is and other aspects. So any of the largest reservoirs there is enough water to, in fact, stabilise the whole of New South Wales for 100% renewable electricity. The height difference between the upper and the lower part of the valley there is about 600 metres, so it's a pretty good site, but it's by no means the only one. Brown Mountain, a bit further south, has got heads of up to 900 metres, and these precincts are dotted all the way out the coast ranges to far north Queensland. So we're absolutely not short of hydro sites. So looking a bit further afield, we're going to find all the pumped hydro sites in the whole world over the next 6 or 9 months, as soon as we can get our algorithms onto the ANU supercomputer, because PCs won't cut it for such a large area of land. Red areas in that image are very prospective, and the next stage is to look in those prospective areas and actually pinpoint the actual reservoirs, as shown in the previous slide. And not surprisingly, the United States has also got some good areas. Orange there are really good heads of 600 metres, and there's also some in the east of the country near the Appalachians. But in short, both Australia, China and the USA, and in fact the whole world, apart from Denmark and Holland, they've got fantastic hydro opportunities. Indonesia, of course, has got lots as well, and all those extinct volcanoes. So you've got to think about the consequences of building large numbers of pumped hydro reservoirs to support vast PV and wind farms. And in fact, you only need 36 square kilometres, which is about 1/4 of the area of Lake Yukonbing, to support 100% renewable electricity system for the whole of Australia. That's 5 parts per million of the land mass of Australia. And that will be spread across 10 to 50 individual reservoirs from the north of Australia right through to the west. The amount of water you need is minimal, and in fact, because you eliminate the requirement for water cooling in a coal-fired power station, you get a drastic reduction in the amount of water used in the electricity system, by at least a factor of 4, probably more like a factor of 7, depending on whether you choose to put evaporation suppressors on your reservoirs, which consists of floating little plastic balls, just to stop the wind taking off the humid boundary line. And you can suppress evaporation by 80–90% and tilt the balance very much towards rainfall. So in other words, rainfall on the reservoir will exceed evaporation in almost every year. So water really isn't a problem, and in fact even the initial fill if you trucked it in at full commercial rates, would only add a few percent to the overall cost of the system. So water is not an issue. It's something you have to deal with, but it's not a constraint almost anywhere. So we've been looking at modelling 100% renewable electricity, and the priority that we put in the modelling was that we only choose technologies that are in true mass production. That's PV and wind for the generation, and pumped hydro for storage, and for high voltage DC for transmission to allow large geographical dispersion. And all of these technologies are being built at a rate of 100 gigawatts or so or more. And so they're really large-scale mass production, so you can get reasonably reliable prices. So we're going to calculate an upper bound because we've excluded batteries, we've excluded demand management, primarily because they're hard to cost. So the prices that we estimate are upper bounds, not average prices. So we assume that it's 90% wind and PV in our modelling, with 10% existing hydro bio, and in other words, all the coal and gas gets closed. And we spread the PV and wind and pumped hydro everywhere, and the result is that the additional cost, the balancing cost of 100% PV wind is about $25 per megawatt hour. Now, I'll put that in perspective. So by about 2020 or 2022, the cost of PV and wind in Australia will be around $50 per megawatt hour. And then the cost of balancing that, so it's actually available when you need it, is another 25 on top, giving you a total of $75. And the balancing cost is the storage, which is about half the balancing cost, the high voltage interstate interconnectors, which is about another quarter, and then you slightly overbuild the PV and wind by 10 or 15%, and that's the final quarter of the total cost of balancing. And the total storage we need is about 450 gigawatt hours, spread across about 21 gigawatt rated pumped hydro systems. So I'll try and put that in perspective in a moment. So this is the all-in cost of electricity. On the left is if we just stop at 50% renewables, which is enough to meet our Paris target, then the all-in cost is quite low because you've still got a lot of old sunk cost legacy coal. If you go to 100%, which represents a 35% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions over 2016 figures, and probably 55% over 2005 figures, which is the Australian baseline, then the price goes up to $75, as I mentioned. If you then electrify all of land transport, so all cars now become electric, you don't actually change the overall cost of the power system because the cars have got a lot of battery storage, and you can get nearly a 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And all those prices are at the bottom end of the current wholesale price of electricity. The PV and wind really are making waves. They're changing the complete nature of electricity production, not only in Australia, but all around the world, because their prices are so low and falling, and the resource base is so large. So you can turn that sort of analysis into a calculation of the cost of hourly balancing. So this is the cost over and above the mere generation you've got to pay to make sure that you've got reliable power. So obviously at zero penetration of variable wind and PV, the cost is zero. And as you get to 100%, the cost is $25. But what you can see is that almost all the cost comes as you push up above 80% renewables. And we're currently, well, by 2020, we'll be at about 24%. So we've got quite a way to go before we actually have to worry too much about balancing at all. South Australia is already at 50% renewables, so it has to worry. But the Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria have got time to plan and do the balancing really well. And in fact, Snow 2.0, which the Prime Minister talks a lot about, will do virtually all of the balancing required for a 50% Australian renewable electricity system. So it's a very great puzzle to me why he pushes that and then criticises the ALP for having a 50% renewable target. If you don't have a 50% renewable target, there's no point building Snow 2.0. So just putting the overall costs on in there. $55 a megawatt hour to get to 60-odd% renewables, pushing up to $75 a megawatt hour for 100% renewables in your electricity system. Looking beyond renewables, if you the easiest way to make really deep cuts in greenhouse gas emissions is to do it in the energy system. Agriculture is hard. Land clearing, of course, is dead easy. You just make it illegal. But the bulk of the reductions has to be done in energy, because energy is 81% of Australian greenhouse gas emissions. And PV and wind are the only feasible way of getting really deep cuts in the short term. There's just nothing else that can do the job. It's got to be PV and wind. And that means that PV and wind has to take over the electricity system, and then you have to electrify everything. And there's two areas of activity that are easily electrified. One is land transport, in other words, electric cars, and the other is to push gas out of low temperature air and water heating. That's also easy with the aid of heat pumps, or even by direct resistors in hot water tanks. And together those three sectors are 55% of Australian greenhouse gas emissions. And they can, 55% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions will have a net cost of probably less than zero, because of the low cost of PV and wind that does the heavy lifting. Even looking at high temperature gas applications, that's gas burning at hundreds or even 500 degrees or more for industrial applications, the current price of PV in really large scale gigawatt rated public auctions, currently overseas but coming to Australia, now matches the price of gas in the Australian market around $9 a gigajoule. So PV and wind are now matching it, even without heat pumps, joule for joule up against gas. And if you look at kerosene for aviation, obviously you won't run battery planes on intercontinental distances without a dramatic technical breakthrough, but the synthesis of kerosene out of hydrogen coming from water and CO2 from the air is dominated by the electricity cost of splitting water. So you really can electrify just about the entire electricity system, and I think this is exactly what's going to happen over the next 20 years. You need to triple the amount of electricity that you produce in order to eliminate all fossil fuels, not just from electricity but from everywhere, including from chemical synthesis like plastics and jet fuel. And it turns out that the world is on track to achieve that task within 20 years at current growth rates of PV and wind. And in fact, current growth rates of PV and wind can get the whole world to 100% renewable electricity in 2030. Now, extrapolating exponentials is always dangerous, because a small change in the growth rate has large consequences 10 years down the track. But it is an interesting fact that PV and wind are no longer invisible on the energy stage, that they've been growing at 28% a year and 15% a year on average over the last 15 years, over the last 5 years, and in the case of PV going back several decades. And that even with a 3% steady growth in demand, which is quite likely to happen, PV, wind and the existing renewables captures the demand in 2030. In other words, fossil fuel in the electricity system goes to zero. Then another 10 years after that, PV and wind has the potential to drive fossil fuels entirely out of the energy system, just like it's likely to happen in Australia. So, in summary, it's a good news story. The PV and wind is really the last best chance to save the world from dangerous climate change, and it's on track to do that. And in fact, for that not to happen, it would really require governments to deliberately stand in the way. And some governments are doing that, such as the current federal government. Other governments are in fact doing the reverse and trying to pull these technologies through. But on the whole, all we have to do is keep growing at the rate we're doing, basically do the job by around about 2040. So thank you, and the website for all our information is shown. So thanks a lot.